October 5, 1967, Quang Tri Province, 1st Corps. A Marine ground controller looked up and watched an A-4 Skyhawk roll in on a strike run. The aircraft was on the correct heading. It was carrying the right ordnance. It was exactly where it was supposed to be. He did not call it in. He could not call it in. The radio was dead. The Skyhawk dropped its load 200 meters short. 6 Marines were killed by their own air support. The pilot never knew. That pilot flew 97 more combat sorties over the next 4 months. He was shot down twice. Both times, the aircraft that engaged him was American. In the entire Vietnam War, the A-4 Skyhawk flew more close air support missions than any other fixed-wing aircraft in the theater. It was the workhorse of the carrier air wings. It carried more ordnance per sortie than the aircraft it replaced, at a fraction of the cost, flown by pilots who averaged 18 months of continuous combat exposure before rotation. It was also the single most frequently struck aircraft in the theater by American ground fire. What the men on the ground could not be told, what the orders explicitly withheld, was why. The Douglas A-4 Skyhawk was not supposed to exist. In 1952, the United States Navy issued a requirement for a jet-powered carrier attack aircraft capable of delivering a nuclear weapon. The specification called for a gross weight of no more than 30,000 pounds. Every manufacturer who read the requirement said it could not be done. Every manufacturer submitted proposals that exceeded it. Ed Heinemann, chief engineer at Douglas Aircraft in El Segundo, California, did not exceed it. He cut it in half. The A-4D, later redesignated the A-4, came in at 14,500 pounds empty. It was so small that its delta wing did not require folding for carrier storage, which eliminated an entire mechanical system and its associated weight, maintenance burden, and failure modes. The wing was the fuel tank. The fuselage was mostly engine. Everything that did not contribute directly to carrying ordnance or flying the aircraft was removed before the first drawing was finished. The Navy accepted delivery of the first production aircraft in 1956. It promptly broke the world speed record for its weight class. The aircraft that was supposed to be impossible was 20% faster than the specification required, and 15,500 pounds lighter than the nearest competitor's proposal. By 1964, when American carrier air operations in the Gulf of Tonkin began in earnest, the A-4 Skyhawk was the primary strike aircraft of 12 carrier air wings. 3 versions were in service simultaneously: the A-4C, the A-4E, and the 2-seat A-4F, which was used for both strike and advanced training. The Republic of Vietnam Air Force operated its own variant, the A-4S, flown from Bien Hoa Air Base beginning in 1967. That last detail matters. It matters because by 1967, American ground troops in A-Corps, the northernmost military region abutting the demilitarized zone, were looking up at A-4s and genuinely unable to determine whether the aircraft overhead belonged to the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, or the South Vietnamese Air Force. The aircraft were identical in silhouette. The markings were not always visible at attack altitudes, and the aircraft were, by 1967, coming in very low. The A-4's designed attack altitude was medium level, 10,000 feet and above, where it could release weapons safely and egress before ground fire found it. Vietnam ended that doctrine within 6 months of sustained operations. At medium altitude, strike aircraft could not see what they were hitting in triple canopy jungle. The foliage absorbed everything. Pilots were releasing ordnance on map coordinates and radio calls from controllers on the ground who were frequently under fire, frequently moving, and frequently uncertain of their own position to within 200 meters. In July 1965, a study by the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing found that 31% of close air support sorties in A-4 delivered ordnance that landed more than 300 meters from the intended target, at medium altitude. The solution was obvious: go lower. The A-4 pilots went lower. By 1966, standard attack doctrine for close air support in First Corps was a roll-in from 4,000 feet, weapons release at 1,500 feet, and egress below 500 feet. In the Mekong Delta, where the canopy was thinner and the ground defenders were often surrounded, some pilots were releasing at 800 feet and pulling off at 200. At 200 feet, a 7.62 millimeter AK-47 round has traveled approximately 0.04 seconds from the muzzle. A man with an AK-47 does not need to aim it accurately at 200 feet. He needs to point it at the correct patch of sky and pull the trigger. The NVA and Viet Cong understood this immediately. Their anti-aircraft doctrine against fast movers at low altitude was not to use anti-aircraft guns. It was to use every rifle in the unit simultaneously, fired upward at the approach path, timed to the aircraft's roll-in. The technique was called massed small arms fire. Captured NVA training documents from 1966, translated by MACV Intelligence, described it in precise detail. The optimum engagement window was during the weapons release phase, when the aircraft was predictably tracking a straight line at low altitude for the 1.8 to 2.4 seconds required to establish a stable attack geometry. The A-4 Skyhawk, by going low enough to hit what it was aimed at, had placed itself inside that window. Between January 1966 and December 1972, the United States Navy and Marine Corps lost 271 A-4 Skyhawks in combat over Vietnam. Of those, 54 were attributed to ground fire from small arms and light automatic weapons, not heavy anti-aircraft artillery, not surface-to-air missiles, rifles, machine guns, the weapon every soldier on both sides was carrying. The remaining losses are distributed across radar-guided SAMs, heavy AAA, and causes listed as unknown. The unknown category is significant. An A-4 hit at 200 feet by a burst of small arms fire does not always have time to transmit a distress call. It does not always have a wingman in position to observe. Some of the aircraft listed as unknown in the loss records were almost certainly struck by rifles. Some of them were struck by American rifles. That is what the orders were about. The first documented incident of American ground forces firing on an A-4 Skyhawk occurred on March 12, 1965. A section of two A-4Cs from Marine Attack Squadron 311, VMA 311, call sign Tomcats, was conducting a strike against suspected Viet Cong positions 6 kilometers south of Da Nang. The Marine Battalion on the ground had been taking mortar fire since 0300. By 0730, when the Skyhawks checked in on station, the battalion's radio operator had been killed, and the surviving members of the forward air control team were operating from a position they had not reported to the wing. The aircraft struck the correct grid. The grid was wrong. The second aircraft in the section, Tomcat 2, was hit during egress by what the pilot described in his post-flight debriefing as a solid wall of upward-directed small arms fire from the friendly tree line. The round, later assessed as 7.62 millimeters, consistent with an M14, entered the port side of the fuselage behind the cockpit and severed a hydraulic line. The pilot, First Lieutenant David C. Brookbank, recovered the aircraft to Da Nang on manual reversion and landed without further incident. He filed the report. The report was classified. The battalion commander was informed. No action was taken at the theater level. That non-response set the pattern for the next 4 years. The problem was structural, and it was known to be structural from the first months of sustained air operations. Close air support in Vietnam required an airborne forward air controller, a FAC, flying a small observation aircraft, who could see both the ground unit and the attacking aircraft and coordinate the strike in real time. The Marine Corps had a robust FAC program. The Air Force had one. The Navy, operating from carriers offshore and designing its strike packages for interdiction and strategic attack, did not have one that was scaled for the volume of close air support Vietnam required. By 1966, the system was improvised. Marine ground officers were designated ground FACs and given radio systems that were supposed to communicate with attacking aircraft. The radios were the AN/PRIE-25, a backpack UHF radio with an effective range of approximately 5 kilometers in flat terrain. In the mountains of Rieux Corps, that range dropped to less than 2. The attacking aircraft were communicating on frequencies the ground FAC could reach only when both parties were within line of sight. In a rolling attack at 4,000 feet, that window lasted approximately 25 seconds. In those 25 seconds, the FAC had to identify himself, pass the target description, confirm the aircraft had visual on the target, clear the aircraft hot, and provide corrections. If the radio died, battery failure, antenna damage, the operator killed, the aircraft was flying without guidance over a position that might or might not be where the map said it was. This is what happened at Quang Tri on October 5, 1967. First Lieutenant Michael R. Downs, a 4E, VMA 533, was on his 4th combat sortie of the day. He had been airborne for 6 hours in 3 separate strikes, returned to the carrier USS Coral Sea to rearm and refuel twice, and was back over I Corps on a late afternoon close air support assignment. His controller, Sergeant First Class Raymond Torres of the 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, had called him in against a tree line 200 meters north of the Marine position, which was taking automatic weapons fire from 3 sides. Torres's radio died 18 seconds into the contact call. Downs, holding overhead at 10,000 feet, could not raise Torres. He could not raise the battalion command net. He could not raise the tactical air controller airborne. There was none assigned to that sector. He had a grid coordinate. He had a description, tree line, north, 200 meters from the friendlies. He had 12 Mark 82 500-pound bombs and fuel for 11 more minutes on station. He rolled in. The grid was correct. The Marine position had moved 200 meters north during the previous 40 minutes of contact, while Torres was maneuvering his team to better cover. The tree line Downs struck was the new Marine position. 6 Marines were killed. 4 were wounded. Downs returned to the Coral Sea without knowing. Torres was not among the casualties. The report Torres filed the following morning described the strike as accurate against the original grid, does not mention that the position had moved, and does not mention the radio failure. It was written by a man who understood that the alternative was to describe the death of 6 Marines as the consequence of a problem that everyone in I Corps already knew existed and that nobody was fixing. The after-action investigation, convened by the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force, found communication failure as the proximate cause and inadequate forward air controller coverage as a contributing factor. It recommended an increase in airborne FAC sorties. The recommendation was not implemented for another 14 months due to aircraft and pilot shortages. Lieutenant Downs was awarded the Air Medal for his sorties on October 5, 1967. The citation does not mention the incident. The formal orders restricting ground fire against fast-moving jet aircraft in Vicor were issued in January 1968, following an incident on the demilitarized zone in which a Marine rifle company opened fire on an A-4 with 2 M60 machine guns and a recoilless rifle, causing minor damage. The orders were bluntly worded. Ground units were not to engage fixed-wing jet aircraft with direct-fire weapons unless the aircraft were positively identified as enemy, which in practice meant never, because North Vietnam did not operate jet aircraft south of the DMZ. The orders did not address the core problem. They told the men on the ground not to shoot at aircraft that were occasionally killing them, without telling them why those aircraft were occasionally killing them, without fixing the communication system that caused the strikes to land wrong, and without providing the FAC coverage that would have prevented most of the incidents in the first place. Captain James D. Hedger, commanding officer of Hotel Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, received the orders in a briefing at Phu Bai in February 1968. He had lost 2 men to a short strike by an A-4 6 weeks earlier. His account, given to an oral history project at the Marine Corps History Division in 1984, is direct. "They told us not to shoot at the jets. We said, 'Yes, sir.' We went back to the field. The jets kept hitting short. Nobody told us they were fixing it. Nobody told us why it kept happening. They just told us to hold our fire and trust the system. We held our fire. We kept trusting the system. The system kept hitting short. The system did not fix itself. It was fixed partially and slowly by the men inside it. The Marine Corps' airborne FAC program, the use of OV-10 Bronco and O-1 Bird Dog aircraft to provide continuous coverage over ground units in contact, expanded from 43 airborne FAC sorties per day in January 1968 to 127 per day by December 1968. The number of incidents in which A-4s struck friendly positions in First Corps dropped by 61% over the same period. The correlation is exact and documented in 3rd MAF records. The Skyhawk itself was modified. The A-4F variant, introduced in 1967, included an AN/APN 141 radar altimeter that gave the pilot an accurate reading of his height above terrain, information that was not available on earlier variants and that was directly relevant to safe weapons release in rolling terrain. The A-4F also incorporated an AN/ASN 41 navigation computer that improved target location accuracy by approximately 40% over dead reckoning methods. None of these modifications addressed the radio problem. None of them addressed the FAC shortage. They made the aircraft more accurate when the information it was given was correct. The A-4 pilots were not told about the friendly fire incidents, not as a category, not as a systemic pattern. Individual pilots received individual incident reports when they were involved. They were not given the aggregate picture that across the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing in fiscal year 1967, 14 confirmed short strikes had occurred, of which 9 involved A-4s, of which 7 were attributed in whole or in part to communication failure. That aggregate picture existed. It was compiled by the Wing Safety Officer, Lieutenant Colonel Harold P. Crane, in a report dated September 3, 1967. The report was forwarded to 3rd MAF and to the Naval Air Systems Command. It recommended that A-4 pilots conducting close air support in I-4 be briefed on the communication failure rate and given abort criteria for when controller contact could not be established. The recommendation was not adopted. The reasoning, documented in the response from 3 MAF operations, was that if pilots were briefed on the full extent of the friendly fire problem, it would negatively affect pilot willingness to press close air support missions to effective delivery parameters. In other words, if the pilots knew how often the ground controllers' radios were failing, some of them might not roll in. That was probably true. Lieutenant Colonel Crane's report was declassified in 1995. Between 1964 and 1973, Navy and Marine A-4 Skyhawk units flew an estimated 285,000 combat sorties over Vietnam, more than any other carrier-based aircraft in the war. The aircraft delivered approximately 800,000 tons of ordnance, including conventional bombs, napalm, Zuni rockets, and, in the war's final months, laser-guided munitions. 271 A-4s were lost to all causes. 53 pilots were killed in the aircraft. An additional 37 were captured and held as prisoners of war. Of those, 29 returned in Operation Homecoming in 1973. 8 did not. The number of confirmed incidents in which A-4s struck American or South Vietnamese positions is documented in declassified 3rd MAF and 1st Marine Aircraft Wing records at 47 confirmed incidents between 1965 and 1972, resulting in 114 American and South Vietnamese military personnel killed and 206 wounded. The true number is assessed by historians of the period, including Eric Hamill and Jack Schulemson, as likely higher. The reporting mechanism for friendly fire incidents required the unit that suffered casualties to initiate the report, and unit commanders had strong institutional reasons not to initiate reports that would trigger investigations. The orders against ground units firing on aircraft, the orders Captain Hedger received in February 1968, remained in effect for the duration of American ground operations. They were correct as far as they went. An infantryman with an M16 was not going to shoot down a jet aircraft. He was more likely to attract its attention and get himself killed. The orders protected the men on the ground from a response that would have made their situation worse. They did not protect the men on the ground from the system that kept putting ordnance on the wrong coordinates. The A-4 Skyhawk was retired from United States Navy carrier operations in 1975. The Marine Corps flew the aircraft until 1998, when the last A-4M left service with Marine Attack Training Squadron 102 at Naval Air Station Kingsville. Total production, 2,960 aircraft across all variants. It remains in service today with the Argentine Naval Air Arm, which flew it in combat in 1982 during the Falklands War, and with several private adversary training contractors who use it to train American pilots in air combat maneuvering against a realistic threat. The Marine Corps' subsequent doctrine for close air support, developed through the 1970s and formalized in Fleet Marine Force Manual 6-18, published in 1978, made continuous airborne FAC coverage a mandatory condition for the employment of fixed-wing aircraft on close air support. It incorporated abort criteria for when controller contact could not be established, the criteria Lieutenant Colonel Crane recommended in September 1967. The carrier, USS Coral Sea, CV-43, was decommissioned in 1990 and struck from the Naval Register in 1991. She was sold for scrap in 1993. Lieutenant Michael Downs completed his first Vietnam deployment in December 1967 and rotated home to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro. He flew a second deployment in 1969. He retired from the Marine Corps in 1981 as a lieutenant colonel with 3,200 flight hours and 11 air medals. In a 1989 interview with the Marine Corps Oral History Program, he was asked whether he ever thought about the October 5, 1967 incident. He said, "I think about it every time I hear somebody say the system worked." 47 confirmed incidents, 114 dead. The orders said, "Do not fire on the aircraft." Nobody told them to fix the radio.